Welcome to Roadside History. Today I'm in the land of Lincoln. I'm in the beautiful state of Illinois. I'm on my way to the town called Ottawa. Ottawa is a famous place in Illinois history because back in the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln, who was a young congressman, was challenging the incumbent senator Stephen Douglas. He was challenging him to win that senatorial seat for the state of Illinois. Douglas was a Democrat, and of course Lincoln was part of this new upstart Republican Party that began in the 1850s. Ottawa would become one of 7 different locations where Lincoln and Douglas would host their famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Today I'm going to take you to that park where the debate took place. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Abraham Lincoln, a little bit about Stephen Douglas, and as well as the conflicts that they both had politically and what they were arguing about. I'll give you a little bit of history on that. Join us for our next adventure. I'm here at Washington Square. It's a park right in the middle of downtown Ottawa, Illinois. This is the site of one of the famous debates between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. First, you need to know about Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas rose through the ranks very quickly. He came to Illinois and he rose through the ranks, became a senator. He was well liked, but he was very outspoken, which would hurt him a little bit later in life. But he would eventually become a presidential candidate in 1860. Douglas was a Democrat. As a Democrat, one of the pressing issues in the United States at the time was the issue over slavery. There was constant bicker back and forth when new states would come into the Union. Should they be a free state or should they be admitted as a slave state? Douglas was a believer in a concept called popular sovereignty, which meant let the people of the state decide if they want to have slavery or if they don't want to have slavery. Lincoln, on the other hand, was from Kentucky and eventually came into Illinois by way of Indiana. Lincoln became a lawyer. Lincoln also joined a new party in 1850 called the Republican Party. Lincoln was a big believer that slavery should not exist and that it should be done away with. Now, I want to preface that by being very careful because Lincoln has been credited in American history with being the great emancipator because of the Emancipation Proclamation. However, if you do a real study in history, you might find that Abraham Lincoln was more about ending slavery where it benefited or where it preserved the country. Nevertheless, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas would meet here in 1858. As I already mentioned, Lincoln was vying for Douglas's senatorial seat. Douglas wasn't going to want to give that up. As a result, they agreed to a series of debates. One of these debates was held here at Washington Square in Ottawa, Illinois. And roughly 10 to 12,000 people showed up. Lincoln had been here many times in his life as he had argued in the General Assembly here. In fact, at this point, that's what Lincoln was. He was a member of the Illinois General Assembly. He had not been elected a senator. But when they came here and they had these debates centered on one issue. The issue was slavery. You see, Lincoln felt that the Declaration of Independence, it mentions that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And his whole argument rested on that hinge that slavery should be done away. However, Stephen Douglas, he believed that slavery should be left to the states to decide. Again, this concept called popular sovereignty. And so they began to debate. Douglas had already gained notoriety because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was settled in 1854, where Kansas and Nebraska were able to enter the Union and the state was able to decide under the concept of popular sovereignty. One of the things that I mentioned is that Stephen Douglas, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, essentially repealed the ban on slavery that was established by the Missouri Compromise of 1850. Douglas had won tremendous popularity because of this. And Lincoln felt that leaving the states to decide would continue to have the slave issue be coming up and continue to be an issue in the United States. So Lincoln fought hard against this. He didn't necessarily believe slavery should end, but he believed that slavery should stop as states were going to be admitted into the United States. This led to a lot of conflict. It led to a lot of conflict in the United States. Ultimately, it's going to be one of the many factors that the United States would soon be engulfed in a war for in the Civil War. Anyway, behind me again, here are the statues. I want to tell you a little bit how the debate went. Thousands and thousands of people came from around to hear this debate and many other debates. In fact, the news outlets at the time had writers that were dispatched that would send off records and get them to the local paper so they could get that out to the people in Illinois. And it really, the popularity of these debates became really big. Lincoln would ultimately end up losing to Stephen Douglas. In those days, the people didn't decide who your senators were. The senators were voted on by your state legislatures, or in this case, the Illinois General Assembly. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted that they changed how senators were elected, or how senators were put into office. Now, of course, it's the people that make that decision, but in those days, it was your local legislators that did that. Anyway, Douglas would win 54 votes to 46. Lincoln would lose the senatorial seat against Stephen Douglas. However, it was a classic case of Douglas has won the battle, Lincoln will win the war. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Dred Scott was a former slave who fought for his freedom. And one of the things that the Kansas-Nebraska Act did is that it allowed for territories to decide if they wanted to be popular sovereign, if they wanted to have slavery or not, under that concept that Douglas championed of popular sovereignty. Well, the courts ruled in the Dred Scott ruling that Congress has no authority to decide if territories can be popular sovereignty or not. And this really irritated Stephen Douglas. As a result, Douglas would introduce the Freeport Doctrine. Basically, the concept behind the Freeport Doctrine was that states can still decide, territories can still decide, they can make hostile laws or hostile legislation to enforce slavery if that's what that territory decides. Now, the problem with that was popular sovereignty didn't sit well with Southerners because Southerners, of course, had slavery and felt like it needed to continue to exist. As a result of that, it's going to divide the Democrat Party. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, Douglas, the Northern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, in the election of 1860. Naturally, with the division in the party, the Democrats didn't hold enough votes, enough electoral votes, and Abraham Lincoln is going to win the election of 1860 without so much as even showing up on several of the ballots in the southern states. Stephen Douglas would end up second. So I mentioned earlier, this was a classic case of Lincoln winning or losing the battle when he ran for Senate, but yet winning the war when he ran for president in 1860. I hope you've had a good time today learning a little bit about Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, especially here at Washington Square in beautiful Ottawa, Illinois. If you haven't had a chance to like and subscribe to the channel, please do so we can continue to bring you short, brief histories along the roadsides that we pass by every day. Till next time, have a safe road trip.